All right, guys, Unit 4. This is Political Patterns and Processes, and just like Unit 2, I've decided to split this into two different sections. This is going to cover more of the basics with political geography, borders, boundaries, forms of governments, whereas the second section, which you'll watch later this week, will be more on devolution and supranationalism. So again, this is more the basics and the more, well, I don't want to say complicated stuff, maybe the more involved processes we're going to see in the second PowerPoint. So let me just briefly run over the big ideas that this unit provides. The first big idea, how do historical and current events influence political structures around the world? So when we think about like what things have happened in the past and things that are happening right now, how do they influence the way that governments operate? How are balances of power reflected in political boundaries and government power structures? So not only externally between countries, but also internally. Who has the power? How is it shared? And how can political, economic, cultural, or technological changes challenge state sovereignty? This is a big one. The idea of sovereignty is power and control, and the ability to decide what to do about your state. So how do changes across several different spheres, how do they challenge those ideas? So 4.1, we're looking at basically the introduction to political geography. We're looking at, for world political maps, be able to define the different types of political entities and identify a contemporary example of those political entities. So in essence, what we're looking at here, and I don't believe I've got so we might circle back. Let me make a note with a pen that I do not have. Here's one. Does it work? No, it does not. Well, I will remember. Well, here's one that I'll touch on: autonomous, semi-autonomous, and blah, 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 blah. Okay, enough of me doing that. Let's move on. Okay, so when we look at a political map, we're looking at countries. We're looking at the borders that separate them, the lines on the earth that do not exist. You cannot see, for example, if you look at Thailand here, the border with another country, there's not a giant line that extends in space that you can see, but we have divided our world into what we call states. Now, we also say the word country. So in terms of political geography, state is a better and more used term to identify what we call a country. So we're not thinking necessarily state is in Georgia, we're thinking state is in Georgia, if you know what I'm saying, right? We're using state as like the country tab. So the states are primary building blocks of the world's map. We know that, and there are certain things that you have to be considered a state, including you have to have a defined boundary. We have to know where you begin and where you end. You need a permanent population, people that call your state home, and that you are there consistently to be able to provide the needs of your citizens. You maintain sovereignty over domestic and international affairs, that the government has the ability to make decisions that impact your country. And then you also need to be recognized by other states, that other states around you recognize you as a state. That's always helpful to be known as a state in general. You also could argue that you need a functioning economy. Whatever that economy looks like, whatever form it might take, you need to have that as a part of your state's building blocks. So now that we have state defined, now we get a little more in depth. So state, you literally could pick any country on the map as your example. So when we talk about nation, now we're looking a little bit more in depth that may not be captured by lines on a map. A nation is a group of people, which we would identify here for basically these first three. We could call them an ethnicity as well. So we can bring in that term ethnicity for these first three bullets. In particular, the first two, but probably the first three as well. So a nation is known by having some sort of common cultural heritage, whether that be your language, religion, political structures, values, beliefs, whatever that is. You have those common beliefs and values that link you with the other people around you. You claim a particular space based on tradition as your homeland, that this is my territory, this is where I'm from, and I have a connection to this physical space. But then to really become a nation, we have to claim and know that it's the desire to establish your own state or express self-determination. In other words, you want to rule yourself. You cannot be considered a nation unless you have the desire to call your own shots and be your own boss. If you are a group of people that is fine with another lording or controlling over you or deciding your fate politically, you wouldn't really be considered a nation. But we can call you a nation if you have these 4 bullets. Now, emanating from that desire to establish your own state is a certain kind of pride, or is a certain kind of ability to recognize your own achievements, and that idea is called nationalism. It is the nation's desire to create and maintain a state on its own. It's a pride that you feel. It's a willingness to be self-determinant in your state's identity, right? You want self-determination, and you have that pride to be able to push for the goals and desires of your nation. So nationalism is that pride, that motivating factor, that spirit that you feel. And in some places on the map, that nation gets its state, and that state that the nation has is really its own space, that there's not really any other nations that occupy that area. It's a singular nation of people who fill the qualifications of a state, and we can call that area a nation state. And the best examples of that are by far Iceland. Well, I don't know about by far, but I'm just going to give you here. Iceland, Japan, Denmark. When we talk about a nation state, there's usually a low level of diversity. You may have very strict immigration guidelines or rules, because the desire is for that nation to occupy its own territory, and that's when we call it a nation state. So by definition, you likely cannot call the United States a nation state, because we are filled with several nations and many ethnicities. So one thing that you can kind of glean from this is the term semi-autonomous region or nation, because this is a group of people that have some control but also yield power to a larger body. So you can bring up like American Indian reservations. They have control of that land, but there are still things they have to follow the U.S. government on, and the U.S. government grants those Native American nations that space as is. So again, this is kind of the idea. It's a progression, right? You have a nation, which is all these commonalities amongst the people and the desire to rule, and then if you have your own state as a nation, it is known as a nation state. Hey, look at there. I did put autonomous region on here. So this would be, just to get a little bit more in depth here, this would be a defined area in a state that has a high degree of self-government and freedom from its parent state. So there is an example of what's called the Åland Islands, which is part of Finland near to Sweden, which has a lot of autonomy away from the larger Finnish government. So again, this is a place that's it's defined inside of a country, but they have a lot of leeway there. You could almost say Washington, D.C. is that way, but that's probably more semi-autonomous than anything, and probably not the best example, so forget I said that. The next example here of a concept in geopolitics is a stateless nation. And this is a nation that, unlike Japan and Iceland that have their own country, this is a nation that doesn't. The Kurds are the best example of this. Kurdistan is a country that if nations all had states, Kurdistan would be part of Turkey and Syria and Iraq. But the Kurds do not have that space, so they are known as a stateless nation. Another example are the Catalans, which is a group of people who live in eastern Spain who have significant lingual and historical cultural differences from the rest of Spain. Barcelona, I didn't really get fancy there with my Spanish. Barcelona is the capital of Catalan. It's the most famous city there in that region, and this is an area that there is some desire to break away from Spain and form its own country to become a nation state, but it has not happened to this point. You also have countries which are divvied up, or states divvied up in certain ways with nations. You have what we call multi-state nation. In this case, you have a nation of people that are split into at least 2 states or 2 countries. So I think the Koreans are the best example because you have North and South, right? You could also say Sudan and South Sudan. Um, in that case, the Koreans is the better example because culturally a lot of similarities, but as history has grown with the division of North and South, that nation idea is splitting a little bit. But still, you'll see. I think it was the 2016 Olympics. The Koreans, North and South, marched under one flag. It was a very powerful moment. That might have been 2018 at the Olympic Games, which were in South Korea, I believe, the Winter Olympics. So again, that idea where you are a nation, a people, a group of people, but split into two states. On the other token, you have what's called a multinational state, which is basically you have a state and then you have multiple nations inside of it. So the issue that can come from this is maybe a lot of conflict, possible conflict between nations that are wanting to do separate things with their one state. Canada with Quebec is a good example. Quebec, of course, more of a French influence than the rest of Canada. Spain, we already mentioned with Catalan, is a multinational state. So multinational state, you do have the potential for conflict. You do not think as Canada and Spain as a country that has a lot of armed conflict. Iraq, Syria, you do see that because you have the Kurds in those countries, and there has been a lot of certainly in the last 50 or so years, a lot of violence in that part of the world. So again, we take these concepts of nation and state, and we kind of mix them up a little bit. So you need to be able to know how to manipulate those terms to be able to describe certain areas of the world. Okay, 4.2, we're looking at processes that have shaped our geography. So whereas we look at like the building blocks in 4.1, now then 4.2 we're looking at um, the motivating forces that help move our country along. So there's or our world along politically. So there are some concepts here that we've already discussed with 4.1, so I won't double dip. For example, nation states, self-determination, we've already hit that. So let's take a look at some of these other ideas. So I guess I am doing self-determination again. All right, so self-determination, again, the desire of a nation of people to rule themselves. So you're going to start to see the world split into building blocks, maybe crumble into several different, large empire crumbles into several different countries. When those nations push for self-determination. So when we think about, like in European history, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Southeast Europe used to be one empire under Austria-Hungary. Even at one point all under Austria. But over time, self-determination motivated independence movements and war and led to the creation of many different states like Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, and others. So self-determination makes it happen. Sovereignty is the power of a political unit to rule over its affairs. I, as a teacher, have sovereignty over you. Right? I have the power to be able to dictate your, well, no, that's a little bit maniacal. So in any case, a country has the ability with sovereignty to basically pull its own strings. China, kind of a case study here. If you look on that map, you see the little purplish blue dot there to the southeast of China. That is Taiwan. So Taiwan is home to a government and a society that evacuated China in 1949 after Mao's communist revolution. And Taiwan is basically held by China, which is under a communist, quasi-communist system. They hold Taiwan to be, quote, a renegade province because China's basic, as it considers itself, its birth came from the end of the government, which is still in Taiwan, right? So basically, if China says, Taiwan, you can do whatever you want, it makes China look a little bit illegitimate because Taiwan is like the mother of China, if that makes any sense. At least if you look at it historically. Now, culturally, again, the Chinese would it certainly say otherwise, that they have, after 1949, created something a lot different than what the past Chinese government would have been, that is now kind of housed in Taiwan. So anyway, the idea is a threat to their power could occur, conceptually if China acknowledged Taiwan's existence. So how do these political processes impact political lines? Da-da-da. So one process that you have studied a lot in school and that we have touched on and we really haven't gone too much in depth, at least politically, is colonialism. Ocean Blue 1492, you know the story. It occurs when people move into and settle on the land of another country, and that period in modern European history began in at least in the mid 15th century, but culminated and really took off in 1492 with Columbus's discovery. European countries motivated by the three G's, gold, God, and glory. Portugal getting into South America and into Africa. The Spanish, of course, expanding into all parts of America, and then eventually the Atlantic states of England and the Netherlands and France getting involved as well in North America. So colonialism, again, was the idea that, hey, we're coming in, we're taking over your land, and we are basically creating a colony that can help serve the motherland for whatever we needed to do. And this process, of course, starting in 1492. We then take about a 300-year break, and post-industrial revolution, when European countries and America are now needing to find new places to buy their stuff and to get resources to make their stuff in these new factories, we get a period called imperialism, which is a little bit more comprehensive than colonialism, which is primarily economic. Imperialism is imposing lifestyle directly upon the people. It's a variety of ways of influencing another country or group of people by direct conquest, economic control, or by cultural dominance. So whereas colonialism is more or less just economics and for an economic motive, imperialism was so much more. Yes, the economic part was a major motivator here, but also the idea of cultural dominance, to prove that your culture at the time was dominant. As we are in an age where Darwinism becomes popular, the idea is proving your dominance is by conquering other countries. That's one way you can do it. So as European powers go out, we have what's called the Berlin Conference, in which European powers carve up Africa for imperial control. And Africa, as we see it today, is very much influenced by the splitting up of territory that happened at this conference. And one of the major themes here is that the creators of the Berlin Conference, Otto von Bismarck of Germany, amongst others, is that they have very little regard for the existing ethnocultural boundaries that were in Africa at the time. So basically you're just drawing it up however you want, and if it means putting two ethnicities or nations inside of a new country that might cause conflict, European powers didn't really care. So again, it's this desire for conquest that led to a total change in the way we see the map on Africa, for instance, Southeast Asia as well, but most at this period of history, mostly with Africa. You'll see that Britain in this kind of peach pale color, that's not peach, but whatever, I don't know what it is, like, I don't know, whatever. That is British territory. And then by 1913, and then the major area here in Western Africa is France, and then you've got certainly Belgium. You got Portugal here, Germany's hanging out, so you got Italy. So you got several other countries involved that are controlling land in Africa. So then as history develops, we get into the 20th century, we then get to a period of independence movements in which these colonies and imperial holdings that the world's powers control decide, you know what, it's time for us to design our own thing, to awaken the desire of self-determination and create our own political destiny. Now, historically speaking, colonists resisted the rule of Europeans. They didn't just lay down and let them come in. But the power to be able to break out and do your own thing needed to be matched by a lessening or decreasing desire to control from European and American countries. Does that make sense? You couldn't really throw them out until the ones that controlled you lost some of the desire to hold you. Now, there are exceptions to that, but that, as a general rule, is what happens after World War II. Now, the British colonies, you could argue, were getting certainly tired of the war and the Revolutionary War, but I think that's a separate example. I think the middle two here is where I want to sit. British India. So the British, while fighting against Nazi imperial control, realized, well, we're kind of hypocritical if we hang out into our colonies after this war is over, because that's basically what we're fighting against and what the Nazis are doing. So the British let India go. India ends up splitting into two independent countries, India and Pakistan, breaking along religious and cultural sorry about that, religious and cultural differences. Algeria also breaks from France. That's more in the 1950s, about a decade after World War II. Again, breaking from the French because of significant ethnic cultural differences. So again, this is kind of what you see across the world as the 20th century develops, and our world, our map, is a lot more complicated now than it has been in the past, because these spirits of nationalism and self-determination have diffused throughout the world, and different nations and ethnic groups have convinced themselves that we should give ourselves the right to rule our own destiny, and you've seen that grow throughout the world in the last 100 years. All right, 4.3. I think this one I think we can go through a little bit quicker. So we're defining the concepts here of political power and territoriality as used by geographers, and seeing how political power is expressed through different territorial or land features in our globe. So when we use the term geopolitics, we're talking about a study of effects of geography on politics and the relation among states. It's basically, how does geography impact power, and how does geography impact government? So there's a concept called territoriality, which is basically what the little girl is doing here in the picture. She's saying, "That's mine, don't touch it." It is a willingness of a person or group of people to defend the space that they claim. That, hey, this is my land, get out. Don't touch it, this is mine. You probably have somewhere in this world a piece of land that you hold important. I know it's room 924 and room 909 in Campbell High School. I get it, I understand. But there's probably other rooms out there that, or well, maybe not rooms, but land that you have some sort of connection to. Right? There are a variety of reasons why you would want to defend or hold your space. And those include an economic benefit. Maybe it's a piece of land that has given you a lot of money. I think my in-laws had or owned some land around Kennesaw Mountain at some point, but then they lost it for some reason. I don't know. I've heard the story a million times. That could have been like really valuable to have now, because if I could have sold it and then retired to some island, and then there would be no coronavirus there, and I would be happy. But alas, I'm here. So there is some sort of economic benefit for you to have that territory, and you want to keep it. There may be some sort of historical connection, that something happened to your people or to you in that piece of land at some point, and to lose that would be real sad. And for me, like, knowing my grandparents have had the same farm my whole life, and if that land is ever sold away from my family, that's going to be crushing, because that land has real connection to me. There's a historical bond, and you can kind of tie that to a cultural significance. You can look at any sort of culture. For example, if you look at the Middle East in Jerusalem, you've got 3 religious groups that claim that space is important to their faith. Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are willing to claim and defend space in the Holy Land because of historical connections, cultural significance to that area. So again, why is land fought over? Well, it could be a money thing, but in many cases, it's this is my history. These are my people. And this land means something to me, and you're not going to take it. So that's what motivates conflict in many cases between countries. So how do states express power through land? Well, the first example really is not through land, but it's more, if we go back to territoriality, it's through the economic connection. So a concept called neocolonialism is developing countries are controlled through indirect means, whether through economic, political, or even cultural power. So the most often here is economic. Remember, back in the day, colonialism involved the government going to and sending troops to another land, taking over, and then building their own political systems there. That was what the British colonies were, right? But with neocolonialism, you may not be there. You may not have a government office there. You may not have military there, but you still have your tentacles all over that country. So if a corporation based here in America sends jobs to a developing country, you can bet we kind of have a hand in what's happening in that country, because we as in the American economy, is providing jobs for that country. So that's where neocolonialism is how we can express power, and other developed countries can express power to others, but basically saying, I am providing you something in your territory. Remember that, right? And that's where the power is coming from. A shadow belt is a region that suffers instability because of its location between two very different regions. So think Eastern Europe, think the Middle East, think Kashmir between India and Pakistan. This is basically an area that's caught in the middle of two very different powerful systems that like to fight over that area. So shadow belt is basically an area, if you think about it this way, it's an area that shatters often because of different levels of conflict. Last but not least is called a choke point, and this is a narrow geographic land feature which reduces the space allowed to pass through. If you control a choke point, you can control transportation in between those two areas. So if we look at an example, here at a choke point, we're looking at what's called what is that? I can't remember it, and it's giving me. But it's the area between the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. And you look at Yemen and Djibouti, so don't look too close. It's kind of rude. But if you look at that pass in between there, it's nice to be able to control that area, basically called a choke point, because as you see, the lines of transportation gets choked off. And to control that, you can control movement from the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and eventually into the Indian Ocean. So it's a very important area that you can control transportation, military movement, and you can express control through that. There's a kind of a cartoon there also to show neocolonialism, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, more control, the supranationalist group, more control by developed countries. So certainly that's a kind of a modern example of that. But all these are, again, ways that a country can express power, right, and use something to increase their own political power. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit and start talking about defining political boundaries. So the next three sections are more about political boundaries and the different types there are and the ways political boundaries work and so on and so forth. So 4.4 is going to look at defining these different types. Really easy way that we can start the discussion is a really easy way to split boundaries up is dividing them either into natural and geometric. A natural boundary is based on physical features. So a river, a mountain. A road, I don't know about a road. Yeah, if a road's natural, it's probably not. But any sort of like natural feature that is used to split that boundary. A geometric boundary is a straight line drawn by people that does not follow any physical feature closely. So if you look at that picture and you're like, that would not look like a border between two countries, but because it's been drawn by two governments, that is the U.S. Canada border. I nearly said Canada, that would not be correct. But it's the U.S.-Canada border right there. It's splitting the two countries up. Natural versus geometric. So now we look at the types of boundaries, the different types that are out there. We first start with what's called a relic boundary, and this is a boundary that has ceased to function. It's something that was used in the past to divide land, but now we ignore it. The Great Wall of China is a great example. The Berlin Wall, the parts of the wall that still exist there. So again, a relic boundary is something that used to mark a boundary, but now it ceases to exist. Antecedent boundary is a boundary that existed prior to settlement in an area. It's usually a natural feature like the Rio Grande River. So that's basically that boundary. It's more of a natural physical boundary that was there before people came. We look at a couple others, a subsequent or consequent. You'll see both words. Just know they're referring to the same thing. The idea is that the boundary is created after settlement, and it's created because of a necessary division, or it looks to be necessary because of a division. Let me just start that whole thing over again. It looks to be necessary because of a division between cultural or ethnic groups. So Northern Ireland and Ireland, there is no natural reason for there to be two different countries, but there is a religious difference between Protestants and Catholics. Same thing with India and Pakistan. There's no reason for two different countries except for the cultural differences provided by religion. Superimposed, we've already talked about this. These borders are put in place by an outside power that is unconcerned with previous cultural patterns. So Africa during imperialism, it's basically if Martians came to the earth and redesigned our land, they basically don't care about our ethnic differences. They're just going to do it to what sets and helps themselves. So then we get into a little bit more in depth of boundaries. How do they function? How are they built? We've seen the types. Now we're going to see how they are constructed. How are they maintained? How are they organized? How are they interpreted? Okay, so if we had to further categorize boundaries into how they are basically more or less the process of how they're developed. We first define a boundary, and we establish that through some sort of legal document, right? A treaty or something basically divides one entity from another. We then have a delimited boundary, which is a line drawn on a map to show the limits of a space. So we basically have to construct it and show it. And those two processes are done very much at the same time. When we basically draw the boundary and we sign on the dotted line, defining it, delimiting it, that's basically looking at the same thing. And then the last process is the line of demarcation. So this is when we take the border and we literally construct it physically, and we see that there is a border here. So this, I would assume this picture is of the U.S.-Mexico border. Looks like here extending through just south of San Diego into the Pacific Ocean. The U.S. is on the right side, Mexico on the left side of that border wall. So again, a demarcated boundary is one that has that physical object placed on a landscape. You don't have to have that. Remember that picture a couple slides ago, the U.S.-Canada border? That was not a demarcated boundary, right? You just had basically a sign. And as I say that, you know, the slide here says, okay, you know, you have the sign here that could be a demarcated boundary. My point is that basically the extent of the demarcation is greater when you have the fence or the wall, right, where it continues on. If you go further past that sign, you're not going to see it, and it's one you're not going to have that's very much present that you can see. All right, so we look now at boundary disputes. So we've looked at the types of borders. We looked at kind of the process of how to create the boundaries. Now just when people fight over them. A definitional boundary is, when a country disagrees on how to interpret a legal document, it can occur with antecedent boundaries. So maybe there's some sort of treaty or maybe a map that was drawn long ago, and now a state or states or countries are disagreeing about exactly how to interpret or define that treaty as it was established in a document. Locational dispute is a disagreement over where the boundary should be placed on the map. So certainly at the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, the division between where Germany and Poland's border should be. So I have a little water break here. An operational boundary dispute. Disagreeing how the border should function, not where it is. We're good with that, but how should it function? And a good example here of European national borders during the Syrian refugee crisis. Should those borders be operated in a sense that shut out all refugees? Should they allow them in? You could also talk about North and South Korea. How should that border function? Should there be travel into the country? Should there travel out of the country, particularly out of North Korea? And then you also have an allocational dispute, which is basically when a boundary separates natural resources that can be used by both countries. So say it's split by a river or a lake or even an ocean. How do you decide how to use resources between the two? Then we create boundaries. This is pretty easy. Most boundaries coincide with cultural, national, and economic divisions. Duh. Some boundaries are created by demilitarized zones or policy. So it might be a treaty, conference, or some sort of agreement that is different than some sort of natural division by culture. So then let me get into, I think, the allocational dispute, which on the UN Convention Law of the Sea was intended to decide. So basically the idea was like, who controls the oceans? Because in human history, basically, if you had the Navy, you were good, right? If you didn't have the Navy, good luck. So the UN Convention Law of the Sea was designed, or UNCLOS, it was designed to reduce conflict over maritime territory by establishing distances of ocean sovereignty, meaning that there was a consistent method applied to countries and how much land and water did you control. So the way this was split up is that at your country, when you get to the beach, you go out 12 miles, that water and land is still yours. So if a Russian ship rolled through about 5 miles off the coast of Panama City, that would indicate an invasion. That would indicate a trespassing of American national waters. And again, you got 12 miles. So then further out from 12 miles to up to 200 miles out into the ocean from your beach, it's called the Exclusive Economic Zone, or the EEZ. And this serves as a way for you as a country not to control the land or the air, I guess, above the water. That's not yours anymore. But you do have the ability to go get resources under the sea. Sebastian Little Mermaid, right? You can go in under the sea and get resources that exist up to 200 miles out from your beach or where your land ends. And then after that, the high seas are open to all states. Now, the problem with the high seas are if there is some sort of crime that happens, say piracy or something that happens on the high seas, there is not a ocean police. There isn't someone who is out there to try to stop all these crimes from happening. It's up to sovereign states to take the lead to try to police the water to make sure that, again, it's not for their own control, but it's for securing the freedom of the seas. And traditionally, America has taken the lead on that. That's something as the 21st century goes on, we may see change a little bit. You never know. But certainly UNCLOS designed to limit disagreements over not only who controls the ocean, but also who can go get resources from the ocean. And just another note on the EEZ, if you think about like oil rigs off the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, they're farther than 12 miles out, right? But they're within 200 miles of, say, the Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana coast. And again, by this law of the sea, it basically says we can drill for oil in that area up to 200 miles out from our coast. And I want to give a second to plug a video series that you might want to go check out. These are from Vox, which is full disclosure, a fairly liberal publication, but they make a fairly unbiased set of videos called Vox Borders, Borders, which I don't know why I had to spell that. That's basically the point of all this. But they do an awesome job of really explaining different geopolitical issues. There's in my class, we watch one every year on Hong Kong, India, Pakistan. There's a good one. This one's an interesting video on why China is building islands, not just controlling them, building islands in the South China Sea. So if you want to go check out those series of videos, they're really good in helping you understand this content, but they're also really interesting. They're really well made. So check out Vox Borders. I'm not being paid in any way by Vox to plug these for an educational sense. They're pretty good. Oh no, I don't want to play it. Stop. I don't want to play it. Stop. Okay, we're good. Well, that got real scary there. We're playing a video. I didn't want to do that. Okay, so 4.6, internal boundaries. So how do we create boundaries inside of a country? We're going to look here at one specific example. This political process here in the United States called redistricting and gerrymandering. And we're not going to go really broader than that. All right, so a little civics review for you. We got 3 branches of government at our national level, right? We got the executive, judicial, and legislative. And in that legislative branch, we got 2 houses, bicameral legislative branch with the Senate and the House of Representatives. So in the Senate, each state gets 2 senators, right? But in the House, it depends on how big your state is population-wise. So in Georgia, we get 14 representatives. And the way, though, whereas when we vote for Senate, everybody votes for the same. Like, you could be, here in Cobb County or in Savannah or in Augusta, Columbus, doesn't matter where you are. You're voting for the same senators. But the House, again, it's geographic. And what happens is the states are divided into congressional districts to elect members to compose the House of Representatives. So each district, as it's drawn on the map there on the right, if you live in that area, you vote for one candidate. And if you go to another color, you're voting for another candidate. So states have the ability to draw their own boundaries. And that happens every 10 years. And that process is called redistricting. The thing is that you got to understand before you draw those, how many people live in your state and where do they live? Because the district sizes are based on population, meaning that each district has to have around the same amount of people living in it. So if you live in the purple area there in the Southwest, there's about as many people that live in that purple area as live in the area of purple around where Atlanta is, right? So the idea is that the physical size is going to be inconsistent, but the number of people that live in each district has to be similar. And the boundaries, again, are redrawn every 10 years after a census is taken. And little did you know, if you did not, hopefully you did, is that this is the census year, and we are redrawing the boundaries next year. Now, the one issue with this is that the states redraw their own political boundaries, meaning that inside of the state, the group or party that is in power is going to draw the districts in such a way that they cement their own power or advantage. And I'll show you an example of how that looks in a minute. But basically what you want to do is draw them in such a way that it is most likely that you're going to get more candidates from your party to get elected than the other team, right? So in Georgia, you got Republicans in charge of the state legislature. They are going to redraw the lines in such a way that favor Republicans in well more than half of the districts that are created. There's different types of gerrymandering that can be done. Cracking is you're taking a group and splitting it into several districts to prevent a majority. So, it's like if maybe in your class there were like 20 girls and 10 boys, instead of creating a group with more boys than girls, you basically crack the boys and you put maybe just 1 or 2 boys in each group, so there's a majority of girls in each group, right? So you want to spread it throughout, and you draw the lines in such a way that does that, because there is a sometimes false but sometimes true assumption that different ethnicities and racial groups will vote a particular way. We look at statistics, we look at trends, we look at the analytics, and that's kind of how they make their decisions here. Packing is combining like-minded voters into one district to prevent them from affecting elections in other districts. Again, you might want to create a district that basically, as the dominant party, you're like, okay, other party, you can get that district, you can take that one. We're gonna just basically put our people and spread them out through everywhere else, but we're gonna stack it in that district, or pack it rather in that district to make sure it's powerful there. And then stacking is diluting a minority populated district with majority populations. So let me show you here an example of how it basically, you have, like on the far left there, imagine you have a state of 50 people and you have 60% blue or Democrat and 40% red or Republican. So if you want to represent those perfectly, you'd say, okay, if you have 5 districts, and thus you have 5 representatives for your state, well, you'd want 3 of them represented by Democrat and 2 represented by Republican, right? Because that gives voice to the amount of people there in your state. So you have 3 blue districts and 2 red districts. However, these can be gerrymandered in different ways. You can do it in a compact way, but it's unfair, in which you can draw the lines in such a way that you now have 5 Democrat districts. That's the number 2 there, the third column, and no red districts. And then you could either, if the Republicans are in charge, you could take a 20% gap in representation and turn it into an advantage. We have 3 red districts and 2 blue districts. So again, it's drawing the boundaries of congressional districts in such a way that gives you a political advantage. So kind of realistically, how that's played itself out in Georgia, if you look here, I want you to look at District 2, which is in the southwest, the blue in the southwest part of Georgia. This is a high populated African American area. It's very rural. It's in fact one of the only areas of the country, this extends into Alabama and Mississippi, where you see high numbers of African American populations in a rural area. So many more of our cities are highly populated there, but this is where we see, right, population distribution in the Southwest. So the Republican Party drew these lines, and most African Americans vote Democratic. So what was done by this drawing, this gerrymandering here, is Republican lawmakers were like, listen, we know that District 2, which is very high African American population, it's also got a big city of Columbus in it, Albany. It's got several there that are high populated areas. We know that it's going to be tough for Republicans to compete there. So what we're going to do is take, if you look in the middle, if you can find Macon right in the middle of the state, basically they took District 2, and really no reason to do this, but to put Macon's population, which has a high African American percentage, and many Democratic voters, also a very liberal area, a college town, they basically take Macon and put it in with the rest of District 2, knowing that it's not probably going to be won by Republicans anyway. So you might as well put all those Democratic voters in there and stack their advantage and pack all them in, so that Districts 8, 10, 3, and 12 can all vote for Republicans. And I'm pretty sure, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure all the rest of those districts do vote Republican. It's kind of the same process in Cobb County. South Cobb is in District 13. North Cobb, East Cobb, which are both more Republican voting areas, were put into different districts. They put South Cobb into a district with Douglas County around through southwest Atlanta, South Atlanta, which is also a Democrat voting area. So again, this is all, I mean, this is the rules that are played. Democrats will do this as well in a state they control, and this is how gerrymandering works. It's just drawing the lines in such a way that gives you a political advantage. I could talk about this all day, but we got another section to do to wrap this up. 4.7, forms of governments. We are looking at the difference between federal and unitary states. So we're going to define those, and then we're also going to talk about how their government looks different. So just to kind of go through them real quick, a federal state is, we talk about branches, where if you think about it more horizontal. With federal, think about it more vertically, where you have a national level of government, but you also have state government, you have local government, and each of those has its own authority. It doesn't necessarily have to do what the other does. And we'll talk about an example to illustrate that in a minute. Unitary government is a central government. So you do have government in local areas, but they do have to say, in all cases, they do have to say and do what the central or national government does. So for a unitary government, kind of the pros for that is that they can serve as a centripetal force. They basically can bring the whole country together. There's not any sort of disagreement, or it's basically you're bringing all things to the table, right? You're bringing it all there. It's a unifying force. There is efficiency. You don't have maybe disagreement. So, hey, once the central government decides something, then that's the way it's going to be throughout the country. And because of that, you have the standardization of laws. That again, you're not going to have different laws in different states or different areas. What you basically have a one cause or one thing fits all. Examples of this: Great Britain, France, Japan. This is not a democracy versus dictatorship thing. You have democratic countries which are unitary. You have democratic which are federal. This is not a reduction of individual rights. However, what it can be is that in a federal government, it allows for more custom-made government in local areas. Let's say you have a government that has a lot of ethnicities, a lot of diversity. It gives those local areas a chance to design local laws which fit its culture maybe a lot better than other places in the country. There are so many examples of this. An example of this is in my county growing up, you still cannot buy alcohol. Okay, it's what we call a dry county. So you have to go to a neighboring county to sell alcohol. A couple of years ago, there was a vote on that, and to keep it to try to turn the county wet. That vote failed narrowly. So my county, you still cannot buy alcohol. Again, Cobb County, obviously you can. So it's obviously something that local areas have a little bit more flexibility based on their needs and wants, and a lot of that comes from maybe more diversity. It's also better served for larger countries, you could say, because you may have and we'll get into this for the next PowerPoint, but you might have an area which is so spatially disconnected from somewhere else for the rest of the country. Think Hawaii or Alaska. They may have to do things a little bit different than what the rest of the country does. So Germany, the United States, Nigeria, the best examples. Nigeria, for example, over 500 languages spoken in Nigeria. It basically comes to the point that if you want to run one system of government through that country, good luck. But there's so much diversity there that you find the need to do that. And kind of a news story that maybe we can connect here that is happening. I'm going to date myself in this presentation. But yesterday, as we go through the coronavirus crisis, of course, Governor Kemp of Georgia has decided to open as of on the time Thursday, April 23rd at 11:01 a.m. He has decided to open up several parts of our economy, what would be tomorrow. Hair salons, tattoo parlors, gyms, things like that, with a lot of, not requirements, but a lot of protections to try to keep us safe in those places. But he's decided to do that. And yesterday, President Trump said, you know what, Governor Kemp's a good governor, but I think he's making a mistake. We shouldn't be opening this early. Well, guess what? That's Governor Kemp's call. President Trump can't come in and tell him to do opposite in this case. The authority for this is given to Brian Kemp. And that is a good example of federal government. It allows Georgia to do things that Georgia feels it's best for, whereas Idaho or Indiana or Iowa have their own call based on their needs, wants, culture, whatever it is. So this coronavirus crisis is a great case study in federal versus unitary. If we had a unitary system, Trump would call all the shots, right? And whatever the federal government decided is what all the governments throughout the country would have to do. The federal system gives flexibility. That could be good, that could be bad. Depends on the way you want to look at it. It's certainly not a centripetal force. It's something that can kind of divide and something that can create division. But at the same time, it may be necessary for different perspectives. Graphically, here's kind of a look at that, unitary and federal, how the national government and the states connect both to the people. of the United States, whereas the national government unitary has all the power.